Well, hello everybody, and welcome to our Tim at 10. Today is Wednesday, September 20th, 2023. Hope everyone is having a wonderful week, and thank you for joining us for this video. Today, we are going to discuss the most commonly asked questions about child care centers and the Americans with Disability Act. The purpose behind this video today is back in March of 2023, we did have amendments to the child care minimum standards that added a lot more language about serving children with indicators of special needs and what they specifically mentioned, special care needs with our child care minimum standards. And, something that I have been talking to a lot of people about with those amendments is that that's really not anything new. All of those expectations that were covered in the child care minimum standards have always been expected. They've just been part of ADA law. Child care licensing here in Texas has now just adopted these into the minimum standards so that, we have a little bit more compliance right there. All right. But, like I said, what I've been telling people all year for the last 6 months, all of those changes in the child care minimum standards should not be new to you. All right. It's something that's always been expected. Now, I've posted this document on my Facebook page many times. So I just posted it again in the chat section for those of you that are live with this webinar. It's also in the description of the webinar on the Facebook page, but there is a link to the ada.gov website that does have the commonly asked questions about the ADA and childcare. I think this is a very critical document for all directors and administrators to have on hand, especially when you are dealing with an issue with a particular family, when you're trying to make a decision to enroll a particular family. It's a wonderful document to have at your fingertips. Now, the situation that we always want to try to avoid in these types of situations is when we do have to expel a child from your program that may have a disability. That's always something that we want to avoid. We want to be able to accommodate the family the best we can. But sometimes we do get into situations where we do have to expel a particular family. This document is going to be very critical for that difficult conversation that you're going to have with that family. Anytime you have a difficult conversation, you want to have supporting documentation that's backing up your decision. So that's going to be helpful for you right there. I'm getting a weird message on Facebook that I've never seen before. So awesome. All right, so if you have this printed out and you can follow along with me, I think that would be helpful. If you don't have this printed out, not a worry at all. We're going to talk about some of the key points. We're obviously not going to talk about everything that's in this document because it is a 17-page document. But I am just going to highlight some of the most commonly asked questions that I receive supporting centers here in Texas and across the country when it comes to serving children with disabilities. Now, keep in mind that, in early education, most of the children that we serve are children that are undiagnosed. And it could be that, obviously the family has not had them tested. They have not been evaluated by a healthcare professional. But in most situations, the children that we serve in our early education programs, they're undiagnosed because they're too young to be diagnosed. And we definitely do not want a child to be misdiagnosed, right? So, that's a bit of feedback that I get from a lot of providers, from a lot of teachers and administrators, is that you have children with indicators of a special need, but there's no diagnosis yet. We're going to talk a lot about this in the upcoming weeks and the upcoming months. This webinar today is just kind of the start of a series of webinars that I'm going to be putting together to help support all of you. Really what we're going for here and what you're going to hear me talk about a lot over the next coming months is getting that willingness. Do your teachers have the willingness to practice new skills so that we can accommodate these children? Do administrators have willingness to see things differently so that we can accommodate these families? That is our ultimate goal, is to be able to accommodate the children and the families that have indicators of a special need. It's not to exclude them. It's not to expel them. It's not to prevent them from coming into our program. Our goal is to support these families and to support these children. But that willingness has to be there first, all right? So we're going to talk about that a little bit as we go through this material. All right, let's go ahead and get started. First off, let's talk about who does the Americans with Disability Act, and especially Title III, who does this apply to? It does apply to all licensed child care facilities, after-school programs, and even home care. So those of you that are a registered home, this does apply to you. The number of employees you have is irrelevant when it comes to, deciding if you have to follow the Americans with Disability Act. The other thing is whether you are for-profit or nonprofit is also irrelevant when it comes to complying with Title III of the Americans with Disability Act. The only exception that you may want to be aware of that will impact some of you that is participating in this webinar or that you're going to watch the video is that if you are operating a licensed child care facility and you are under a religious entity, all right? So if your program is owned and operated by a religious entity, then you could be exempt from the Americans with Disability Act and Title III. All right. Now, in order for that exemption to take place, the licensed child care facility or early education program has to be owned and operated by the religious entity. If you are just simply housed in a religious entity, so like the child care center leases space from the church but is not operated by the church, all right, then you are not exempt. All right. Or if the child care center operates as a separate entity from the church. All right. So in many times there will be a separate tax ID number or a separate EIN separating that licensed child care facility from the church. In those types of situations, you probably don't have exemptions. Okay. But if the licensed child care facility is owned and operated by the church, then you probably have some exemptions. However, you just want to be careful with this because a trend that we are seeing in courts right now is that you only have some of these exemptions if they are consistently followed. So all of your practices are consistently followed. We talk about this a lot with employment laws, when it comes to religious exemptions. Yet there are some particular exemptions out there, but if you're opening your business up to the public, so basically anyone can be your customer, you actually lose some of those exemptions. So when we talk about a religious entity being exempt from ADA, if you are opening your child care center open to the public and basically anyone can enroll in your program, you've got to be very careful because in that case you could lose some of those exemptions. Now, the hard part about this is that this is typically not going to come up or come out until you go to litigation. All right, until you actually do have a lawsuit or you do have charges filed against you and you go to litigation. That's when this is going to come out. So you're probably not going to even know this until you get to that point. So in my opinion, those of you that are part of a religious entity, it would be in your best interest to go ahead and try to follow these laws the best you can, just to keep it simple. Keep it simple, all right? But otherwise, if you're not part of a religious entity, whether you're a licensed childcare program, after-school program, licensed home or registered home, you are subject to the Americans with Disability Act. All right. And basically, what the Title III of the Americans with Disability Act says is that licensed child care facilities cannot exclude children with disabilities from their program unless the presence of that child would pose a direct threat to the health and safety of other individuals, or the presence of that child would create a fundamental alteration to your program. All right. And we're going to talk about this a few times. This is going to come up where we talk about a direct threat or a fundamental alteration to your program. But other than that, you cannot exclude an individual with a disability. All right. Or the presence of that child creates an undue hardship. And we'll talk about that a little bit more too. An undue hardship basically means that there is a financial impact to the business for having that child. It's going to cost you extra money. Those are very difficult to uphold. So, we generally tell people when trying to make a determination to enroll or expel, focus on the direct threat or the fundamental alteration of the program, because the financial part can get really tricky right there. All right. But basically what the law says is that when you do have a child with a disability or a special care need, it is your responsibility to make a reasonable modification to your program so that you can accommodate that child. You're going to hear me talk about what's called an individualized assessment. So when you're determining whether or not you can enroll a child, when you're determining at what point can you expel a child from your program, you're going to need to do an individualized assessment on that child and the situation before you can make that decision. An individualized assessment is basically your documentation, all right? So there is no form or document that you're going to fill out, nothing formal like that, but it's basically your documentation, and it needs to be ongoing documentation. Okay, so we're not talking about you have one occurrence of a direct threat. It's going to be something that's ongoing, that's very documented, all right? And we'll kind of talk about that more as we go along too. Okay, when you do have a family that inquires in your program and they do disclose that their child has a disability, this is when, like I said, you're going to do the individualized assessment. You're going to want to talk to the family. You're going to want to get information from the child's healthcare professional, other educators that are working with that child, therapists that may be involved. And you want to be able to ask that family for the child's individual education plan or their IEP. All right, so that you can make a determination on whether or not the child can be successful in your program. What I always like to recommend that directors and administrators do is, send a copy of your program description to the child's healthcare professional that is treating that disability. All right, and in that program description, you're going to include your child staff ratios, your group sizes, your daily schedules, your curriculum, right? Basically, what does the child's day look like? All of those type of things. And let the healthcare professional give a recommendation on whether or not that child can be successful in your program. Kind of take that decision making out of your hands. All right, so it's not you, the director, that's making that determination. It's a healthcare professional or the therapist, an individual like that. If there are modifications that are recommended by these individuals, at that point you'll document this in your individualized assessment. Are you able to make those modifications, or would it create a fundamental alteration to your program? And if it does create a fundamental alteration to your program, this is where you're going to have that very well documented. Okay? So that's what you're going to want to do right there. So make sure that you're talking to as many individuals as you can. Now remember that you do need to keep privacy. So under the Privacy Act, all of this information needs to remain confidential. Information is shared on a need-to-know basis only. All right, so kind of keep that in mind right there. All right. Something else that comes up from time to time when we talk about accommodating children with disabilities or special care needs is what if you're full and you have a waiting list in your program? Having a disability or a special care need does not make the family a priority on your waiting list. So they don't automatically get to be moved up to the top of your waiting list. You're going to add this family to your waiting list just like you would any other family. And when the spot becomes available, the spot becomes available. But just because the child has a disability does not move them to the top of your waiting list. So that comes up from time to time. I think as we enter the fourth quarter of 2023, we're going to have some other challenges that are going to be coming to the operation of our centers. We'll have a whole nother webinar on that coming up soon. But, I think that we're going to have a lot of centers with waiting lists. We're going to be very limited on spots in the very near future. And so just kind of know that if you run into that, that child having a special care need or a disability is not going to bump them to the top of the list. All right. Another very commonly question is children that have that require individualized attention and kind of need more one-on-one care. And can you exclude a child from your program that needs a little bit more attention? Well, here's the way the law looks at it, and the way this is reviewed by the Americans with Disability Act and the way it's viewed by, court. Most children, most every child out there at some point in time will have a mental or emotional state that requires a little bit more attention. All right? So you kind of have to look at this as like the big picture right there. Just because this child has a special care need or a disability that requires a little bit more individualized attention does not make them different than anyone else, because every child, every adult at some point in time requires a little bit more attention. Okay, so you got to dig a little bit deeper than just that. One thing that you really, when you're doing your individualized assessments, when you're making a determination on whether or not you can include a child in your program or exclude a child from your program, you've got to be very careful with stereotypes. All right, just because the child has a special care need or just because the child has a disability, you can't automatically make the assumption that they can't be part of your program. This is what's going to get you in trouble really, really quick, is when individuals stereotype children or families or they make judgments. All right, and that's why, once again, your individualized assessment is so critical in these types of situations. When we talk about children that need individualized attention, people are very quick to make that judgment that they're not going to be able to be successful in your program, and you can't do that. You can't make that quick judgment or stereotype. So when you're working with your teachers, when you're working with your program, this is going to be a big topic of conversation. You got to stay away from stereotypes and judgments. You've got to look at each child individually, all right, and take those judgments and those type of things out of it. Okay. Now, once you do enroll the child in your program and you start to see that the special care need or the disability is creating a direct threat to other children. And what you want to look at here is, does the special care need or the disability create a direct threat to that particular child, the other children in the classroom, or the adults that are working with that child? Okay? And you can exclude a child from your program at that point in time. But once again, your individualized assessment is your key. All right, and you want to have good documentation of multiple occurrences that's creating a direct threat. All right, one situation where a child has a meltdown and may have a direct threat, that one situation is probably not going to be enough to exclude. It needs to be something that's ongoing. All right, and you're definitely going to want to document what type of training you've done for your staff. You're going to want to document skills that have been practiced with the teachers and the child. You want to show that you made a reasonable effort to assist this child with their particular special care need or disability. All of that needs to be documented in your individualized assessment. And once again, generalizing a situation or adding stereotypes is not going to be helpful. You want to stay away from that. All right. Because once again, when you talk about direct threats right here, whether the child has a special care need or a disability or not, every child out there are going to have triggers. Every child out there is going to have moments of upset. And so you're going to have direct threat with basically anyone. So that's why the individualized assessment documenting the reoccurrence of this is going to be critical for you right there. Same thing when you run into situations with children who are biting, children who are hitting other children. If that behavior is due to a disability or a special care need, this needs to be included in that individualized assessment. Once again, you want good documentation of the efforts that you made to prevent this from happening. When we go back to suspension and expulsion of children, and I do have a webinar or a training, sorry. I do have a training on my website that goes over suspension and expulsion of children. It is your responsibility as the licensed provider to make every effort to prevent this from happening. And you're going to outline what steps you're going to take to prevent a child from being expelled from your program. Same thing is true right here. And hitting and biting, these types of behaviors, you want to be able to document what you and your teachers have done to prevent this. All right. And then if the behavior is still reoccurring at that point, then you've got some grounds to dismiss. But I had told you that when you have to have this difficult conversation with a family, the document that we're using today from the Americans with Disability website, this is a really critical document to be able to show that when you do have a documented direct threat, you do have a right to dismiss. Once again, we want to avoid this. We want to be willing enough to practice new skills so that we can accommodate this child and this family. We want to be able to lend skills to the family that they can practice at home to support the behavior, to support the child in their development. We want to really make sure that we're showing every effort to keep that child in our program. All right? So keep that in mind right there. And like I said, I've got some more webinars that are going to be coming out in the coming weeks to kind of help you with some of those skills that your teachers who are willing can practice in the classroom to help support these children. Because y'all, we can do this. We can absolutely do this. All right? Just remember, a question has come up recently, and this is in this document as well, about service animals. Service animals are protected under the Americans with Disability Act. We don't see this very often, but you could see this in your program. So you can see that you do need to make accommodations and modifications to your no pet policy if you have something like that. But that's kind of a case-by-case basis that we can look at if you do have something like that that comes up. Same thing with children with delayed speech or developmental disabilities. And can I keep them in an infant toddler classroom, or am I required to move them up? Right there. One thing that you're going to see with Title III of the Americans with Disability Act is that children must be placed in an age-appropriate classroom. Their ability and opportunity to learn cannot be withheld simply based on their disability or special care need. All right? So holding a child back simply because they have a disability or a special care need, that can get you into some trouble right there. Especially when we talk about speech delays, we have very common that we have 3, 4, 5-year-old children that are nonverbal at certain moments during the day. Even as adults, when the world is not going our way, we can become nonverbal, right? Depending on our state. So, once again, you got to separate those stereotypes, generalizing the situation that I'm not going to be able to accommodate this child because of their speech delay. You got to have to move past that, okay? Because we see this it's a very common situation that we see in our early education classrooms, all right? So what you want to focus on right here, once again, is that a child can never be withheld the opportunity to learn based on their disability or their special care need. Okay, so they do need to be placed in their age-appropriate classroom. All right, that's what you want to look at with that. All right, you cannot charge a parent a higher fee for a child with a disability unless the center is having to pay additional expenses based on that child. So, for example, you have to bring in a registered nurse, or you're having to hire a particular therapist, and there is a added expense to that program that is not normal for other children. There are some exceptions to that, but once again, there's quite a bit of documentation in your individualized assessment that you're going to need to place before you can do that. My advice to y'all is stay away from charging a higher fee. All right. All right, so I see a question that's popping up on Zoom about children that are not potty trained. Guess what? That's next. That's next on my agenda to talk about right there. Actually, let me talk about medications really quick, and then we're going to get into potty training. So, a big trend that we have been seeing in early education for about the last 5 to 7 years is a lot of centers that are going to a no medication policy. Especially the insurance companies are advising this because there's a lot of risk in giving children medication. And, you want to avoid that risk right there. If you choose to go to a no medication policy or limited medication policy, you do need to remember that certain medications are considered a reasonable accommodation to a special need. And so you can't exclude that. All right. So if you do have a child that has a breathing machine or has behavioral management drugs, or children with diabetes that require blood sugar testing, all of these are examples of reasonable modifications that could be made for that child with a disability or a special care need. There's a lot of talk right now about EpiPens and administering EpiPens. That is a reasonable accommodation to a special need. So you are required to accommodate in those situations. All right, now let's talk about potty training. All right, so can you hold a child in a younger classroom whenever they are not potty trained? The basic answer right here is generally no. All right, you cannot hold a child back simply because they are not potty trained. Specifically when the potty training is due to a special care need or a disability. Once again, the opportunity to learn cannot be withheld from a child due to their special care need or their disability. Changing a child's diaper or cleaning up a child that's had an accident is considered a reasonable accommodation to a special need. That is something that we do for all children when they have accidents. It would be no different for a child with a disability or a special care need. Saying that we do not enroll children in our 3-year-old classroom, or we do not move children up into our 3-year-old classroom until they are potty trained. Once again, if the child not being potty trained is due to a disability or a special care need, this can get you into some trouble right here as well. The response that I get from a lot of providers is, well, we don't have diaper changing tables in our 3-year-old classroom. Yeah, you can't go there, all right, because number one, diaper changing tables are technically not required, All right, they're not required by child care licensing. They're not required here. It basically just says that children must be changed in a sanitary manner. All right, so saying that we don't have diaper changing tables in our 3-year-old classroom, that's not going to fly, right? And the fact that, the biggest thing here is, does it take changing this child's diaper or cleaning up this child, does it take away from the supervision of the rest of the group? Okay, now that's where you can do some documenting in your individualized assessment. All right. What we typically see in these cases is that it is reasonable for another adult to be able to step into that classroom for 5 minutes to assist with the supervision of the children while that child's diaper is changed or they are cleaned up. Okay. And in most cases, you have a director or an assistant director or another adult in the building that can step into that 3 or 4-year-old classroom to assist with the supervision of children while the caregiver cleans up this child. That's typically how this is looked at. Now, if you're able to document on a reoccurring basis that you do not have an additional adult in the building that can step in for 5 minutes to assist with these personal care needs, then at that point, you might have a leg to stand on. But generally, most of us have someone in your building that can step into that classroom for 5 minutes to assist with the supervision of the children in those situations. Okay? So my advice to y'all is excluding a child or restricting a child due to potty training. Y'all, you're just going to need to accommodate that, all right? Because it's going to be really difficult for you to be able to prove that this is an undue hardship or it's a fundamental alteration to your program, all right? Now, when we get into some of the older children, we're talking about 7, 8, 10, 12, that may have some toileting issues or personal care issues, where we are starting to see more of a health concern, that you've got bodily fluid or those type of items that other children are exposed to, and it's creating a health concern in that area. That's going to kind of go in a different direction right there. All right. But once again, you want to have good documentation in your individualized assessment. All right. Fantastic. All right. So hopefully this was a little helpful to you. This document, once again, the commonly asked questions for licensed child care centers and the Americans with Disability Act. I definitely encourage y'all to print that, go over it, be familiar with it. It's a very well written document. It's very easy to understand, but it's really going to help you when making these determinations. My biggest point of having this webinar today is to get you to understand that all of these amendments in our child care minimum standards that came about in March of 2023, none of this should have been new to you. It's always been part of ADA law. They just added it into the minimum standards, so we have better clarification and enforcement. All right. The other thing, like I said at the very beginning, because I saw a lot of people that popped in here late, so I want to repeat this. What we need to focus on is willingness. All right. Do we have teachers? Do we have administrators that are willing to assist children with disabilities and special care needs? Are they willing to practice different skills so that we can meet these children where they're at? Our goal is to include them. Our goal is to accommodate them. But in the event that you do have a situation that you cannot meet that family's needs, you cannot meet that child's needs, I wanted you to be able to see what the expectations were right there. All right. Let me just read what we have right here. Inhaler, someone's asking, does an inhaler count as a reasonable accommodation? Yes, it does. All right, that is considered a reasonable accommodation to a special need. All right. Someone wrote me a big old novel. It's hard to read a big old long novel when I'm also trying to speak. Sorry for the dead air for just a moment. Just an important point right here. When you do have a child that has a special care need or a disability, and there is some additional training that needs to be done for your staff on how to use particular devices to assist that child. The device does, the training that the staff receives needs to be done by a healthcare professional. All right. So this is where you got to be really careful with this, because the parent coming in and training the staff, unless that parent is a healthcare professional, they are not. They can't do that training right there. All right. So if there's a particular piece of equipment to be able to make that reasonable accommodation, the training has to be done by a healthcare professional. So keep that in mind right there. All right. I'm trying to figure out what's going on over here in the chat screen, and it's not making sense to me. All right. I will address that one-on-one with the individual that's typing a whole bunch of stuff. Okay. All right. So I hope this was helpful. Look forward to some other topics coming up about serving children with special care needs and disabilities. And so I've got some other stuff that I'm planning to do at Tim at 10. Remember, all of these videos are recorded and placed on our website. So if you weren't able to attend the live video, you can watch this on our website. If you are needing a certificate of completion for today's training, there will be a worksheet that you can complete. I will put the link over here in the chat screen, or you can go straight to my website, timthetrainer.com, and you can complete the worksheet to get your certificate of completion. There is a $5 fee for the certificate. If you don't need a certificate, then these Tim at 10s are 100% free. This training today was verified by TechPeds, and so those of you that are part of TechPeds or Texas Rising Star, these will be uploaded into your TechPeds account as long as you have your TechPeds ID on your profile on timthetrainer.com. And so whenever you sign in, you can make sure you add that. So that's important right there for you as well. All right, let me go ahead and get the link posted for you so that y'all can do that worksheet, those of you that are needing that certificate. Very good. All right, everyone have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday, and hopefully we'll see y'all very, very soon. All right, bye everybody.